Hello. Hello and welcome to your lecture on the responses to capitalism for AP World History. We're in the time period 1750 to 1900, which is basically everything leading up to World War I. 5.1.5 is about the spread and global capitalism and basically the responses from different states. So in the industrial states, the workers start to organize themselves. They're asking for changes in working conditions, changes in hours, and higher wages. Some other countries are going to oppose. Basically, we're going to get new political ideologies that come out of these movements, and we're going to talk about those individually on the following slides. One of the most important aspects of the development of the working class is to understand this term that we call proletarianization. Basically, the idea is that previously everything was handmade and everything was a craft, and so as the labor system and the factory system develops and it becomes less and less personal, the workers become less and less invested in the final product. And because they're no longer invested in that final product, their focus shifts from the quality of that product into determining the value of their labor. And as a result of that, you start getting demands for things that where the workers feel that their labor should be valued in a certain way. And so the labor unions are going to start to organize in order to protect this new working class that we call the proletariat, to basically put a value on labor, because previously the value was found in the quality of the product, and now it's no longer about that because everything's mechanized, everything is standardized, and so the quality of the product is set by the machines and by manufacturer quality controls and things of that nature. So now the laborers need something else to be their motivation, and that's where wages come in. Labor unions start as a way for workers to start to communicate with their employers and then ultimately their government. And so they want to develop things like standardized wages, because at this point they were told how much their labor was worth, where they wanted to be able to tell the employers how much they feel their labor is worth. Working hours were very difficult until reforms started being made. These people would work 10 to 12-hour days. If the sun was up, they were working in the factories. There was no limits on how long somebody had to work. There were no limits. Your employers could demand quite a bit of your time and energy without consideration to things like your health and well-being. And so the workers wanted those things to be considered, and setting things like a maximum number of hours that people have to work in a day or should work in a day. Working conditions were awful. There's tons of injuries all the time. And if you got injured, then you were just out of a job. It's your own fault. You shouldn't have put your hand in the machine that way, things of that nature. And so what the labor unions were asking the employers to do is to add a little bit of protection in regards to the working conditions and start establishing rules and regulations that the factories had to comply to protect the workers' health. Like I said, injuries are part of that working condition, and if there's no workman's comp, there's nothing that goes with being injured in regards to protection. Ultimately, these laborers were working very, very hard, and so there was no form of what you were supposed to do after you stopped earning a wage. The wages were so low that you were barely making enough money to survive. So therefore, there's no opportunity to save for not working when you're 60, 70 years old. And so the workers wanted to find some way to protect the elderly, which is something that won't actually be enacted into the U.S. Regulations until the 1930s, 1940s. Oftentimes, if the labor unions and the workers felt that they were not being heard, they would go on strikes, which basically means they would stop working. Unfortunately, strikes don't always work because there are people who are worse off than the laborers, and so they would hire other people, and sometimes the strikes ended up failing. Oftentimes, they were very successful, though. Chartism is an example of one of the earliest labor unions, and it developed in Great Britain. So basically, local artisans started to organize themselves politically, and what they wanted was universal male suffrage. At this point in time in England, only the landed aristocracy were allowed to vote or run for office. You had to own land. You had to have a deed in order to participate in the government. Well, at this point, the workers wanted to have a say in their government choices, and so they wanted the right to vote. They wanted to hold annual elections to the House of Commons, which is the second part of the British legislature, and they wanted everything to be done through secret ballots. Secret ballots are something that develop over time. Previously, if you owed somebody a favor, or let's say an aristocrat got you a job, they expected you to vote in a certain way. This was a huge problem in the United States as the immigrants were coming in, and it's something that the government attempted to regulate, but it was very difficult to do. They also wanted, in order to become a member of the House of Commons, you had to own land, and the Chartists wanted that to go away as well, so that the working class could have an opportunity to actually become part of the government system and work within the government system to meet the needs of this new proletariat social class. Marxism is a political theory that Karl Marx wrote about in a book called The Communist Manifesto. He published it in 1848. Basically, he stated that the proletariat, who are the workers, would ultimately get upset enough that they will overthrow the bourgeoisie, who are the wealthy class, and social classes will cease to exist. Marx didn't necessarily promote this in the Communist Manifesto. His later pamphlets and things like that will promote this idea, this revolution, but he felt that his understanding of history showed that this is what people would just naturally do. That ultimately the masses, the majority of the population, will ultimately get angry enough about their living, working conditions and their inability to meet their own needs, and would ultimately revolt against the existing government. They start to form different types of communism throughout all of Europe. And we'll talk about each one of those versions of Marxism as we go throughout the different the rest of the course. This is not socialism at all. Socialism basically supports a capitalist economy, where Marxism supports a government-run economy. So you cannot use the term socialism and communism interchangeably. Those are two very different political beliefs. Socialism is a new radical political theory during this time period that states that all humans are equal. You have to remember that leading up to this time, the aristocrats were special because God picked them to be special in the year 600, and their great whatever managed to become an aristocrat, and that was because God loved them more. At this point, in the post-Reformation era, the post-Renaissance era, and the post-scientific revolution era, people are starting to think that you're special because you said you were special. It has nothing to do with this God-given right. And that idea starts to be prevalent throughout all of Europe. And the working class in specific wanted to be treated with the same humanity as everyone else. So socialism is the idea that every human is equal. It doesn't matter race, gender, ideology, whatever. It's just a basic idea of equality that counters old feudalistic ideas about the hierarchy of humanity. Different groups will argue about how to achieve this equality. Some socialist governments feel like you can achieve this equality through different regulations. Some socialists feel that you can create communes. There's all kinds of forms of socialism out there, and we'll discuss those as well with the forms of communism as we continue throughout the course. Equality doesn't necessarily mean economic equality. We're talking about equality and things like opportunity, that every single human born within whatever country has the exact same opportunity as everyone else. That is what socialism is. How much the government regulates that is where you get the different versions of political parties. Equality, socialism actually does work with a capitalist system. It does work with capitalist economics, and it does work with private ownership. That is the key to economics. But again, all this plays out differently in every single country. So you have to look at this within each country that we're discussing throughout the course. Utopian socialism is a form of socialism that develops mainly in France, and it's going to spread. We actually do have some utopian socialist community attempts in the United States during this era as well. The idea is that you can achieve this equality of humanity through these communes, and these communes would create this concept of cooperative socialism. The idea that everybody in your commune, everybody in your community would contribute to the well-being of the neighbor next door, and that the idea of sharing and that humans were capable of creating equality without revolution or without violence and things of that nature. They wanted to use rationalism, basically the scientific method, in all forms of life. So this does not include religion in any way, shape, or form, because religion cannot be scientifically proven, and so it's separate from that. The other idea is that rationalism, that human beings are capable of being rational human beings. Marx and Engels felt that utopian socialists were out of touch with the reality of humanity. Marx and Engels actually used the term utopian as a way to kind of make fun of this form of socialism. They felt that the people who attempted these communes did not understand human nature and the human need for motivation to work, and so the socialism that is going to be promoted by Marx and Engels is called a scientific socialism. And Marx and Engels, basically what ends up happening is the communes end up with these strict rules and regulations to maintain cooperative socialism. So really it's a totalitarian state. These little communes have all these rules and regulations that you have to follow in order to maintain this equality. Well, enforcing those ends up creating a hierarchy anyway. Anarchism is another political idea that develops during this time, where they wanted to abolish all governments. People who were anarchists felt that people could self-govern without any type of hierarchy or any type of person telling them how to act and how to be. The origins are founded in Taoism, which was coming into Asia, or coming into Europe out of Asia through this globalized trade. And many felt that Christianity teaches anarchism as well, because of the idea of rationalism and free will, that humans were capable of choosing to act right without being told to act right. William Godwin is a writer. He wrote Political Justice in 1793. That is the base foundation of what becomes anarchism. And he stated that the government creates ignorance and dependency, and that the government's goal is to continue to have humans be ignorant and dependent upon this hierarchical system that was already in place. He felt that if people were taught to reason and critically think, then the government would be unnecessary. He felt that rules and laws were a form of mental enslavement, and that teaching people to follow those rules and laws was actually debilitating human possibilities and the capableness of the human being. Proudhon is a French anarchist, and he wrote a book called What is Property? It was published in 1840. He stated that ownership of anything or anyone allows the owner to abuse that property, and that government protects this idea of ownership, and that there's no way to create peace or equality if ownership even exists. So the idea of communal wealth is something that becomes part of a lot of or communal resources becomes part of this anarchist ideas. Part B specifically wants us to address the Qing and the Ottoman Empire and a couple other empires as well. In the Ottoman Empire, we end up with this system called Tanzimat, and Tanzimat literally translates into the English word reorganization. The Tanzimat reorganizations last from 1839 to 1876, and the goal was to modernize the Ottoman Empire while maintaining all its geographical holdings. They are going to be unsuccessful in maintaining its geographical holdings, and some of the reorganization is going to fail. They wanted to make major changes for all the ethnic minorities that is found in the Ottoman Empire. If you remember, the Ottoman Empire has been expanding a lot through the last time periods. And as they expand, they're going to continue to create ethnic minorities. Like the Ottomans are going to control Egypt, they're going to control Greece, they're going to control a large portion of Eastern Europe. And all of those different people speak different languages, have different cultures, have different religious beliefs. And none of that, there's no regulation or protection for any of those people in any type of law code within the Ottoman Empire. Some things that Tanzimat is going to do, they're going to end the Dershime system. They're going to get rid of the Janissaries because obviously that was a enslavement of an ethnic minority, so they're going to get rid of that. They create a currency, they create post office, they reorganize all the financial systems, they create new criminal and civil law codes, and they finally conduct a census. Only men were counted, but they finally actually count everybody who's part of the Ottoman Empire, which is going to allow for increased efficiency in taxation. They create a Ministry of Education. They are actually going to try to Ottomanize, basically promote the Ottoman culture through this education system. They're going to abolish slavery and the slave trade as well, and they establish colleges, schools to educate teachers and academies. They create a Ministry of Healthcare. There's new trade and commerce codes. They establish an Academy of Science in order to increase scientific research in the Ottoman Empire. Europe is obviously outstripping the Arab countries at this point in what Americans and what the Western world would like to call progress. And so the Ottomans want to kind of reestablish themselves in regards to science and math. They create a planning council for Istanbul, and they want to kind of restore the city. There hasn't been a lot of work on the city since the early Ottoman rulers, like in like the 1500s. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to the buildings and the roads and things of that nature. All non-Muslims can now become part of the army, which is trying to create a sense of pride and nationalism for the Ottoman people living within the Ottoman Empire. They're going to reorganize all of their land, and that's part of the taxation system as well. They create, one of the biggest impacts is they create a civil service school system where people can actually learn in order to get jobs within the government system. And they grant citizenship to everyone, no matter what your ethnic minority or religion or language is. The Arab majority doesn't like Tanzimat at all. And in fact, the rich Arab families are going to take advantage of this, and they enroll their children into the school system very quickly. And then they end up in these government jobs, and they end up maintaining their privileged status. So this is one of the things that's going to lead to the failing of the Ottoman Empire by 1920, because they don't actually accomplish ethnic equality. They don't actually accomplish, economic equality or even social movement within the Ottoman Empire. It does not happen with Tanzimat. In Qing China, there's a specific movement called the self-strengthening movement that develops. The gentry, which are landowners, try to combine Confucian ideals with Western technology, but it doesn't really do much. They want to be agricultural. China does not want to industrialize. They want to remain agricultural, but they want to industrialize within the cities, but in a very specific way. The Empress Dowager doesn't support the movement at all, and so they had no money to actually do this. The biggest problem for Qing China is the foreigners. At this point, the foreigners are running their economy. They're basically running the show. Britain has managed to get a huge portion of the population addicted to opium. They've managed to control a lot of their rights, and basically the Europeans are taking over. The Germans are controlling the railways and a lot of the mineral extraction from the land. The French are controlling the south. The British are controlling the Yangtze River Valley. Japan is controlling the southeast. Russia is controlling the northern regions of Manchuria. The only area where there were no European foreigners or any Japanese foreigners was the middle of China. And so at this point, there's a lot of Chinese who have lost faith in the Qing Empire, which is going to create revolution in the next time period. This map kind of gives you an idea of what China looked like in regards to who was controlling what. Please take note of Manchuria up near the Korean Peninsula. We will be discussing Manchuria in great length leading into World War I and World War II. Qing China actually did have a movement under one emperor called the 100 Days Reform. The goal was to remake China into an industrial power. He thought that they could do it in 100 days. They had to let go of all of their agrarian traditions. They had to let go of their culture. They had to let go of some of the things that were not Western. They wanted to establish a constitutional monarchy. They wanted to establish civil rights and civil liberties. They wanted to change the education. They wanted to modernize their military. The Qing have their army's still not trained in guns at this point, and so that's a problem. The imperial household reacts violently, and the emperor actually disappears. He ends up being held hostage in the Forbidden City at this point, and anybody who was involved in the 100 Days Reform is going to be executed, and any of the reforms that were passed within the 100 days are completely overturned. Part C, there's some specific states that we need to talk about where the government promoted state-sponsored visions of industrialization. One of those countries is Russia. The emperor, the Tsar, is going to put Sergei Witte in charge of industrializing Russia. And one of the biggest things is going to be railway construction, obviously with the Trans-Siberian Railway. They put high protective tariffs on foreign goods so that people will buy Russian goods instead. And one of the most important parts is in very Peter the Great type of move. They're going to bring in Europeans to try to teach them how to industrialize their country. Everything is successful for Russian industrialization at this point, and it creates the same social movements associated with industrialization, like the creation of labor unions and things of that nature, which we will discuss in detail leading into World War I and during the Communist Revolution for Russia. One of the biggest changes for Russia, because they need to provide a labor source for these new factories, is the emancipation of the serfs. The serfs were free. They can move about how they wished. Some did manage to go into the cities, but they worked on these little farms called mirs. Mirs were basically like a commune or a village system. The peasants had to pay a tax to the nobility, so they end up in debt, and so the emancipation of the serfs really didn't do anything for the lower classes of Russia. Meiji Japan is going to create subsidies for private companies to industrialize. They also bring in foreign advisors just like Russia does, and they improve the transportation network of Japan. Japan is huge on railway building during this time period. It's very easy to get around Japan today because of the railway system that was built during this era. They do create a new education system where they focus on science. That probably should not surprise you, especially since a lot of our new technologies are today still come out of Japan. Their business owners and the government are basically one and the same in Meiji Japan. They're going to basically work together. The government's going to help fund them. It's a symbiotic relationship. Women were allowed to be educated under Meiji Japan, and there's a huge amount of new jobs. Unfortunately, there's no workers' rights or any regulation of anything. There's the treatment of workers is very harsh. If you try to escape, you usually got killed. There's no emphasis on human rights. There's no documents. There's no constitution. None of that is part of the Meiji Restoration. Going down into Egypt, we need to talk about Muhammad Ali. He was a commander in the Ottoman army, and then when Egypt gains its independence from the Ottomans, he basically creates modern Egypt. One of the things that he does is he nationalizes the tax farms. Nationalization is where the government controls an industry. So he puts this massive tax on the old tax farmers, and the tax was so high that they couldn't pay it, and so ultimately the government ends up controlling the land. He creates a new tax that weakens the wealth of the old elites. This is something that the Ottoman Empire did not do, which is why the Arab rich were able to still be in control in the Ottoman Empire, where in Egypt, Muhammad Ali does something totally different. He controls trade. The government controls trade. The producers sell their goods to the state, and then the state would control where and how those goods are sold within their country and, of course, outside their country. Everybody starts making money. The producers are guaranteed to sell their products to the government, so they're guaranteed a wage, which means that they could purchase the goods once the government resold them. He focuses on cotton. and he rebuilds irrigation systems. And he uses one of the things that Muhammad Ali does that is not very progressive is he still uses the corvée labor system, which is basically enslavement. He creates this new industrial complex by focusing on weapon production. He builds cannon and musket factories, and then he also builds shipyards in Alexandria, and Egypt's military production is insane. And of course, he's going to sell a lot of this to the European powers as a result of World War I. He also built his own navy at this point, but the biggest thing is the textile production for Egypt, and he's going to bring in European advisors, but he's still using corvée labor, so he's not actually paying anyone to do any of this work. There will be protests. A lot of the lower class actually leave. A huge population of Egyptians move into Syria. And the peasants sometimes would maim themselves, like cut off their fingers and stuff so that they didn't have to work in these factories. He's going to create an educated class by sending students into Europe. And he also builds a professional bureaucracy. He organizes land into 10 different provinces. And at first he's appointing most of his people are going to be related to him in regards to government positions. We need to talk about some of the negative effects of the industrial capitalism, but basically how some countries are going to reform those things. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck basically knew that socialism was going to be an issue, and so he started passing laws they weren't allowed to assemble and they weren't allowed to publish anything, but he also passed new reforms that actually made sense and actually made people happy. So one of them is he creates a healthcare system in 1883. He creates this thing called sick days in 1883. He also creates accident insurance in 1884, so basically workers' comp. So if you're injured on the job, you don't lose your job. He also creates an old age pension, which is we call it Social Security. If you are over the age of 70, the government's going to actually give you money so that you don't have to work anymore. He also creates an unemployment program with job training, and so if you do get fired, the government's going to help maintain your wages by giving you some money. In Great Britain, we're going to see an expansion of the right to vote. So I wanted to give you an idea of where that came from and what happened in the 1800s. So in 1265 was the creation of a two-house legislature, which we call Parliament. The House of Lords is one of the houses, which is unelected aristocrats who own land from way back in the day. The House of Commons was small landowners who were elected by male landowners. The English Civil War expands the power of the Prime Minister, and in 1819 there's a violent protest where 15 people were killed by the government. And so people start getting a little bit more aggressive about wanting rights after that. So we have several Reform Acts there. You have the Great Reform Act, the Second Reform Act, and the Third Reform Act. In 1918 is where women gain the right to vote, and in 1928 is where 1928, all men and women over the age of 21 can vote in Great Britain, and that's still the case today. One of the biggest reforms that the British are going to do is the English Factory Act of 1833. The main issue was child labor. No child under the age of 9 could work anymore, so that was done. The workday was limited for children, and the factory owner must pay for the education of the children for at least 2 hours a day. This is a huge change in the concept and the idea of education in general. Teachers are now responsible for education rather than parents, and so we're going to eventually start to get standardized curriculums and things of that nature. Public education really began, the form that we have now, really began in Germany. Otto von Bismarck introduced this idea of a preschool program like kindergarten, as well as the idea that all students should receive the same content in a public system. In the United States, our public system is based off of different states, and the reason for that is that each state has different economies and different jobs, and so the idea was that a federal curriculum would not work as each state needed different types of laborers. In Great Britain, the expansion of public education really began in 1808 with a National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor. It was a private program basically funded by charitable contributions, and they started holding school on Sundays the only day that workers were off, in order to start to educate working class children. In 1833, in 1833, with the English Factory Act, they started building more and more public schools. And in 1837, Parliament voted to fund public schools through taxation. This is something, obviously, that the United States is going to do as well. It became free and compulsory in 1861, and by 1861, 95% of British children were enrolled in the school system. The Forster Act in 1870 is what creates kind of these school board regulations of the programs, and they said that all children between the ages of 5 and 13 were required to attend some type of primary school. The Elementary Education Act in 1880 expands the ages. All children from 5 to 10 must attend school, and it's going to be enforceable through parental involvement. So there's some laws associated with the Elementary Education Act. Under Queen Victoria, the curriculums were modernized. Like they took out a lot of the older curriculums and increased more science and maths and things of that nature. And the British are also going to start creating vocational training, like job training, in order to create a skilled working class as well. In the United States, the first major reforms of public education were done by a guy named Horace Mann. He creates basically what will become the base of the American system in the 1830s. The idea that teachers should be skilled professionals was new in the 1830s. Previously, a lot of your rural areas and even in your cities would have these one-room schoolhouses where a teacher would go in, but teaching was not, academics weren't going into teaching. If you were an academic, if you were, you went to university in London or anything like that, you did that on your own. You didn't necessarily, and you were rich. These teachers, there was no curriculum for teaching teachers how to teach, and Horace Mann wanted to change that. A couple other things that Mann is going to change is organizing students by age groups, which is how we get the program that we're in today, and the idea that the content should be standardized, that there is a specific content that every American student should understand and be held accountable to. And they created basically what we call the factory model of schools. By around 1900, 34 states had compulsory laws where only 4 of those states were in the South, where they required attendance to school until the age of 14. By 1910, 72% of children attended school, and then by 1918, every single state in the United States required completion of at least an elementary school education. After the Civil War, the Freedmen Bureau builds 1,000 schools around the South just for blacks, and both adults and children were enrolling in these schools. They spent over $5 million setting up the system, and by 1965, 90,000 people were attending these segregated schools. The data on the teachers is about half the teachers were Southern whites, a third were blacks, and a sixth were Northern whites. Most of them were women, but African American male teachers did outnumber African American female teachers. Obviously, Brown versus Board of Education forces the desegregation of schools, which Duval County in Jacksonville was actually still in violation of Brown versus Board of Education laws in 1994, which is why the county created the magnet system. Taxpayer-funded schools in the South began in 1867 in the post-Civil War era as part of Reconstruction, but conservatives will cut the funding in the 1870s, and the schools will remain segregated until Brown v. Board of Education. The progressive era, which is the 1890s to 1930s in the United States, will change public education dramatically. This is when they start the concept of high schools. By 1940, about 50% of U.S. citizens, U.S. children earned a high school diploma. They are going to, basically, it was a very slow movement to create the high schools, especially because we were still, a large portion of us, U.S. citizens were still farming. But by the post-World War II era, everybody, the children of the baby boom are going to get a high school diploma. So, for example, my parents' generation is really the first generation to get where everybody got a high school diploma. Previously, my grandmother only made it up to 8th grade because she lived in rural Kentucky. So the idea of a high school diploma was new and wasn't really something that happened until we get into the post-World War II era. During the Depression, one of the biggest changes for this movement towards like this compulsory education is adults wanted to move kids out of the labor force so that the adults could have jobs. And as a result of that, we developed the expansion of the education system as part of the New Deal recovery program created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the 1960s, arguments over curriculum and what needed to be taught in the classroom began, and we are still having those arguments today. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Have a great night.